Matthew Buckley Smith, and you're listening to SLEERICKETS, a podcast about poetry and other intractable problems. This week's episode is a little more in the weeds than the sort of thing I would usually feature on the main feed, but fuck it. It's been a long week. I've been working on some prose for 32 poems, and it was a fun conversation, and if anything, the other half of it is even more in the weeds. So I did have some real technical problems with the initial data, so the sound is not great, particularly my sound is not great, which is, especially fitting because in the second half, I make explicit fun of the sound quality of another podcast, which is pretty rich, coming from the robot lost in a wind tunnel that I sound like. But this is a conversation about Laura Writing's farewell to poetry. She was a famous, influential poet. You'll hear a little biographical note on her, but she quit poetry, and then many decades later, she wrote an essay called "The Promise of Words," in which she explained her decision to stop writing poetry. We talk about that. We talk a little bit about her relationship with Robert Graves, about one of his poems. And then in the second half, the second half is basically a half-hour conversation about Laura Writing's poems, and then a half-hour conversation about chess versus poetry, as well as some gripes I have, not really with Versecraft, but with the Catholic Church, I guess. Setting aside the chess and Catholic Church part, one thing I think you could say about this episode is that it may be the one time that Shane will agree more with Elijah than with me. In fact, many of you may agree more with Elijah and with Cameron than with me. I am a total curmudgeon in this episode. I think I was in a grouchy mood, but I also am... I am a bad sport about Laura Writing in general. So do with that what you will. I enjoyed it. I think it's a fun conversation, and I hope you will enjoy it too. It takes us a while to get to what she is actually saying in the essay. That is not entirely our fault. That is at least half the fault of the essay itself. But I will let Elijah do the introduction to writing and get right into it. If you want, I will have the second part of this conversation. I think I'll give it a separate title because it's a different enough topic. But I'll have the second half of the conversation up on the Secret Show feed in the next day or two. That's sleerickets.substack.com. You can put in your email address, and it will give you a week's access for free. After that, it's pretty fucking cheap. So go check out all of the over 100 odd episodes up now at sleerickets.substack.com. And in the meantime, I hope you enjoyed this conversation.
Should we introduce her at all, or do you want to just give her read the sentences and then we can introduce her? Like, what do you want to do with this?
Well, Elijah, you did a wonderful episode on her and Robert Graves, and
that was a good episode.
Do you want to do a quick little bio?
Sure, and I'm happy to do it with Cameron since you are the one who proposed this episode. And
I'll add something if you miss anything. Sure. But yeah, go on.
Laura Writing, really fascinating modernist poet. Started being active, I think, in the late 19-teens, 1920s. Her first book of poems caught the attention of Alan Tate. She was quite close with the Fugitives for a while, but then she gravitated away from that and towards more experimental horizons. Basically because she, kind of like Wallace Stevens, used poetry as a vehicle for philosophical ruminations, speculations. And her idea was that poetry, in a sort of utopian sense, was the greatest linguistic method for getting at truth. And that I had an essay that I wrote in my MFA program where I compared her with Matthew Arnold, because as dissimilar as they seem, she sort of shares this view of a poet as a kind of shepherd of culture, or a shepherd of thought or civilization. She has this idea that, like Shelley's legislators of the world, that poets can move society towards better thinking and towards truth, and can, in Mallarmé's phrase, purify the dialect of the tribe. Can really be caretakers of language in a very important moral way. And so her poetry it can be, it isn't always, but at its best, it can be very philosophically intense in a way that I think sometimes even exceeds Wallace Stevens. And she's certainly more austere than Wallace Stevens. She's not nearly as sensuous as he is. At a certain point, she got connected with Robert Graves. He became quickly very infatuated with her, practically worshipped her in an almost cult-like way. And actually, I mean, and literally a cult-like way, because her ideas and her as a muse were the origin and catalyst for the White Goddess. So she lived with Graves for quite a while. They cohabitated and they influenced each other's work. They had a sort of menage a trois situation, actually a menage a quatre at a certain point. And she was this kind of spiritual dominatrix. So she presided with this cult of personality over these other lovers of hers, and they all lived in this. I forgot where the island is. It's an island in the Mediterranean. Yeah, at a certain point there was a falling out, and she famously jumped out a window and broke her legs, and and then even I mean, that's not funny, but more funny than that is that Robert Graves proceeded to run down the stairs and then jump from a safer height.
Yeah. Yeah, I was gonna say that. I was waiting to see if you'd missed out.
Yeah.
Fucking amazing.
Oh, yeah.
Right. So
Left Athens twice against philosophy.
These are the mystical utopian modernists we're dealing with. One of the most notable parts of her autobiography, or her biography after that, is that she forswore poetry at a certain point for ideological reasons. She wrote an essay, which is the ostensible topic of today's episode, where she gave her reasons for why she abandoned poetry, because she believed that it was not the ideal vehicle for pursuing truth or for articulating truth.
And she gave herself over to like linguistic philosophy, right?
Yeah, yes. So she went on to pursue linguistic philosophy in prose, and to manage an orange farm in Florida.
She published a book of prose fictions, which I have not read, but a lot of people say is sort of like where sort of fiction and philosophy meet. And like one of my big criticisms, which will eventually get to her, is that I'm not really sure her philosophy holds that much. It seems quite thin. But I was just going to add that she's one of the few poets who they've actually made a film about. It's called The Laureate. I watched like half of it. It was pretty boring, but the film was about her sort of relationship with Graves, right? And sort of interest in the the sort of threesomes and stuff, and the sexual relationship, and then there's sort of occasional references to her poetry, and like T.S. Eliot turning her down, and T.S. Eliot being like a sort of sexual predator and blah blah blah. And like I think the only good scene in it, or the only sort of scene that I found interesting, was she's in like a bedroom with one of Robert Graves' sort of very young daughters, and she says, "Do you trust me?" And the daughter says yes. And she's like, well, if you really trust me, if you really believe in me, then you need to believe in magic, because I believe in magic. And you're like, if you believe in magic, then you can step out of this window, because there's this invisible ladder going down to the floor. And like she basically persuades this girl to step out the window. And then like at the very last moment, she sort of tells this girl to stop. And it was sort of the only interesting scene when I thought like, wow, Laura Riding is actually a very compelling character here. And I kind of
is there any biographical basis to that? Do you know?
I don't know. I have no idea. Jesus. I hope there is.
Yeah, I mean, it does seem indicative, whether it's true or not, of her borderline psychopathic reveling in manipulation.
She sure writes like a fucking psychopath. Also,
yeah, and
it's fascinating.
Yeah, and it's interesting, the tension between her interests and her personal life, because she has this like Byronic personal life, but she claims to be so devoted to reason and abstract linguistic and philosophic investigation.
Byron was also a monster, but he's fun to read.
Is he? I disagree, but another thing. Okay.
Oh, and then I saw on the 50th anniversary of her quitting poetry, she won the bowling gun.
She also there were also like articles about her and Robert Graves in the London Review of Books, which is where this article from her comes from. And I forgot to send it to you, but she writes in this letter just sort of complaining viciously about Graves and sort of just, I think, takes him down in this sort of little letter she sends to the London Review of Books. It's just quite funny.
I'm
But yeah.
interested in the fact, Cameron, that you like Laura Writing and Clarice Lispector. They write completely differently, but they kind of seem to be of a piece in terms of maybe your attraction to them, like your attraction to these kind of witchy figures. Do you think that that's, do you think that I'm
Yeah.
on the money there?
I think you could. I think you're like. I think that's kind of true. Like maybe it's just my own pretensions. I would say that like it's more than like if I found Laura Riding as a writer uninteresting, I'd become quite quickly bored of her. Like a sort of witch-like appeal would not hold me long enough. Like I need them to be good, if not great writers, to be interested in them. But like yeah, the sort of charisma helps because I guess I'm very fascinated with sort of the mystical element of writing. And despite despite writing's puritanical sort of rationalism, there's a kind of mysticism to her character. And I guess I am kind of vaguely interested in this sort of psychopathic, manipulative, psychological element. But I think, like, I honestly, the spectre and writing are kind of similar because I think what writing is trying and failing to do in poetry, I think the spectre is doing in a lot more sort of in as much as she is insane, but I think in a lot more sort of understanding way in writing. I think the spectre understands that writing cannot communicate truth as writing desires it to, and is sort of I know she's engaged in this kind of losing battle, but goes on with it despite regardless, because I think she's operating under a sort of less logical driven and much more sort of instinctual, even mystically driven approach to writing. But I think in its kind of simplicity compared to writing's high rationalism, there's something about the Spectre style that wins out. I mean, the Spectre keeps writing, and I think she's a better writer. She's a better writer than writing. I think she creates a lot more enduring stuff than writing does. But I think they are of a piece, not just in their sort of charisma and appeal, but I think in their actual approach to writing, even if stylistically they are, in a sense, different, but I think less different than you give them credit for.
Yeah, and I think one interesting thing is sort of the motivation to write for both of them is quite different, or even though maybe they have some similarities in writing and personality, because I get the sense that Clarice Lispector wrote out of like pure compulsion, right?
Yeah.
Because like
Yes.
she
Yes.
felt like she was dead when she wasn't writing.
Right.
Whereas
Yeah.
for writing, I think writing got her existential nourishment from feeling like a messianic figure. And when she felt
Hmm.
like she couldn't be a messianic figure in poetry anymore, she had to pivot to something else.
Yeah. What is my big criticism of the essay we'll get onto? Is that like like for me, who does sort of write more out of compulsion than out of like a desire to purify the dialect of the tribe, this argument for poetry, for the argument for the fate of poetry does make logical sense to me, but it has no effect on my desire to write poetry because there's no effect on my compulsion to write.
It also, am I mistaken in having the impression that she wrote this long after she actually stopped writing poetry?
Yes, yes, yes.
So,
I
like
think,
decades after.
yeah, I think basically interest in her reflourished and she jumped onto it and sent the LRB. I think maybe her collected
I thought this was the introduction she wrote to one of her later collecteds.
yes, yeah. So I think it might have been either it's the introduction to her poems or it's the introduction to a book of essays she published much later on. But I think her poems were issued and was reviewed in the LLB alongside Robert Graves, and she wrote in a letter. And then I think she may have then had some contract with the LLB because she wrote this piece. She also sends in a poem, which is just sort of chopped up prose, explaining exactly why she left poetry, like very similar to this piece, but sort of chopped up lines instead of this sort of long essay. But slightly ironically, I guess. But
But that like
yeah,
I like neither her poetry nor her prose, but I take this with an enormous grain of salt as concerns her poetry because she wrote it like she is an authority on her own writing, but also I feel like writing this decades after quitting poetry, it, like should at least inform the degree to which we read this as a an accurate description of what she was doing at the time.
Right, like you think there's a Poe's philosophy of composition kind of dynamic at work.
I don't even necessarily think she's being dishonest or artificial. I just think like, I mean, if I try to, I mean, this was like 40 years after. Like, if I try to describe what I was doing as a child, I don't think like that's necessarily all that reliable an account of what I was doing at the time. Like, I think I will have some insight I didn't have then, but I don't know how. I'm not sure if I'm capturing the spirit of it, right? With my 30 to 40 years, distance.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the
Particularly if I had renounced what I did as a child, right?
But maybe you would think that if you were sort of a monomaniacal mind as writing is.
Oh no, that's the thing is I think she believes what she's writing here. I just think that like the people who read her poetry and loved it and then read this essay and were disappointed and thought like, oh, she's betrayed her poetry. I think like, well, like this is almost a different person, right?
Hmm.
The person you're reading then, like, I don't know if that is actually, I don't know if this actually gives you much insight into what that was at the time. I think it does give you
Yeah.
insight into how she thinks about poetry and like has something to do with where her mind was then. But like she was a demonstrably wildly erratic person, and like if not a compulsive liar, then somebody who certainly behaves in other dimensions like a compulsive liar might. I don't, I don't know. This is a thing she wrote. She also wrote some poems. I don't like any of them, but I do want to, in a way, like I want to give more credit to the people who like her poetry for liking something that may not be truly affected by this argument.
Yeah, I think
Well, yeah.
I do think there are
Sorry,
probably there were a lot of people around who would have read that article who were also around when she gave up poetry. So I think that if she was saying something totally off base, it would have been at the risk of inciting other people to contradict her. So I think
Or maybe, but I don't know that she's talking. I don't know that she's saying this isn't telling tales out of school. This is like describing her inner logic.
Well,
I mean,
I
she was
disagree.
also
I mean,
surrounded by like my guess is like she surrounded herself throughout much of her life by people that she was constantly like enchanting in a spell of words. And so like I'm not sure if any of them would have said like, well, thinking back to the semi-coherent rant that you delved into, the night of December 3rd, 1934, I'm not sure this essay is consistent with it. I mean, my guess is like, I don't know, most people reading this, I'm assuming, again, like it's possible that I'm the dumbest man on earth, but like I'm assuming a lot of people reading this had the same experience I did, which is like, this is a fucking
I'm
drag
not
to get
sure.
through. I could only understand it with the greatest effort. And when I did understand it, it wasn't fucking worth it.
I disagree. I think like this was designed to propagate people. I mean, like the fifth paragraph is almost certainly just an attack on John Ashbery, who claimed when he published Some Trees that he was deeply influenced by writing. Writing at that time sent him a letter telling him not to be influenced by her because his poetry was not attempting to do anything like she was doing. And I think like continues this argument in the fifth paragraph. So
there's some sentences in that paragraph I underlined that I totally agree with. I won't. I'm in a way like I'd be surprised if you agreed with them, Cameron. But that this essay contains some sentences I agreed with here and there doesn't make it a good essay or a coherent one.
Did
I
you
think
have
it's
to
pretty
read?
coherent.
Did you have to read a lot of theory when you were in school, Matthew?
I did. It made me
Yeah.
fucking furious. Some of it was better than others, but a lot of it I just like, is there actually a good reason for this to be written the way it is? And I think the answer is almost never yes.
No, I mean, I completely agree with you. I've because Laura has been in her PhD program, and this happened when she was in her master's too. She has to read all of these just ridiculous essays by Frenchmen of the 20th century.
Laura, if you're listening to this, my heart goes out to you. Jesus Christ.
I know. I mean, she like despairs over this, and so what she'll often enlist me to help her parse what is being said.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, no,
I think having been recently exposed to that mire, reading this felt not so bad.
yeah. I mean, my friend is my friend is reading Derrida and Beauvoir, and like I'm often like brought in to like explain what they mean, and like yeah, compared to like honestly, I don't find this particularly yeah, like I think it requires work and like mental work, but I don't find it incredibly obscure. And I think compared to like Derrida, Beauvoir, I mean, compared to a lot of like the idiotic postmodernists, it seems to be made by someone who has a very clear control over language, and like there's no jargon going on here. There's no sort of
Well, the jargon is
me.
private jargon. You're right. She doesn't use technical jargon. She just uses words. She uses, again, 15 abstractions in a row, gives examples of none of them, and then expects you to understand how she means each of those words. Like beginning with the first couple sentences, there are at least two words poetry. One meaning linguistic activity of a certain kind, the other meaning verbal matter produced by such activity. Okay. I only understood that what she didn't mean by the first part of that sentence when I got to the second part of that sentence, but I still don't understand what she did mean by the first part of that sentence. And I will only sort of vaguely begin to gather what she does mean by the version of poetry that she claims she's talking about here. Like, I guess she's sort of talking about something kind of in the ballpark of Elizabeth Bishop's That Self-Forgetful Perfectly Uses Concentration, except that, Bishop thought it was worth doing for its own sake, and writing seems to believe it's done in the service of some greater truth. But like, I don't know if that's a meaning. Like, are there two things that poetry is? If those are the two things, I'm not like, I don't know. And like, that's just the very beginning. And then from there, she moves on to abstraction after abstraction. I mean, even like just the section about murkiness in prose versus murkiness in poetry, that was like, what a promising, fascinating beginning to an argument that then she doesn't elaborate on at all, and I don't fucking know what she's talking about. So like I don't think she's not using deconstructionist jargon, but she's using her own jargon. She's using words. She's doing a Humpty Dumpty, right? She's using words to mean what they mean to her, and then moving on.
I'm not sure about that. I think like this sentence, like okay, so there are so the essay is called The Promise of Words. It was published in the London Review of Books. Does it say the date here? No, okay. Oh, ignore me. It doesn't say the date. You will never know. It was published in volume 16, volume 16, number 17. Oh, volume 17, number 17. There we go. Yeah, so you can look that up.
Roughly the same year.
Yeah. So yeah, the first sentence, the first paragraph is there are at least two words poetry. One meaning linguistic activity of a certain kind. The other meaning verbal matter produced by such activity. Right. So she's saying, when people give an activity, when people sort of say this activity is pure poetry, they're talking about sort of the linguistic activity of poetry as a kind of ideal, right? A kind of sort of aspirational, powerful linguistic form, as opposed to poetry and poems, which when we talk about sort of in a literarily critical sense and in technical sense, meaning sort of often versified language placed in lines, which is sort of the verbal material, right, issued by the production of a poem, right? This seems to me what
totally
she's
perfectly unclear to me what you just said.
I think it's what she's saying very basically comes down to people say things like, "Oh, I write poetry," and then people also say, "This is a book of poetry." And
right, yeah.
I mean, those are just the two different senses in which one can talk about poetry.
Also,
she's saying, I write poetry and poetry in motion, right?
So wait, is she saying that one is figurative and one's literal?
No, just
that does not seem to be what she's saying.
Poetry can be. Oh, I'm sorry. There's a train on my end. Poetry can be an activity. Okay, good. Poetry can be an activity, and it can also be a sort of physical piece of writing.
Right. So this book contains poetry, if you want to call it that. Actually, this is not the word. There was a much worse book I got at the same time as this one. But like, this book contains poetry, say, and then also you could say, when I'm writing a poem, I could say to the world, I am writing poetry right now.
Right. Yeah.
It's not clear to me how meaningfully different those senses are. Like,
I think she's just trying to point out
something
that
will be
essay,
comparable to this book that I'm holding, that currently contains poetry.
I think like what she's trying to warn us is that in this essay, she's not going to be addressing poetry as a kind of literary critic. She's going to be addressing it as a sort of philosophical matter, right? A sort of a conceptual matter. She's not going to be talking about
that's fine. It feels like a total sleight of hand to me. Like it feels like she's saying, I'm going to be referring to something with the word poetry, but I'm not going to quite let you know what that is. And I know what I mean in my own head. And, I can turn invisible if there's no one here to look at me. Like it just feels like, okay, fine. I don't, it's like she does it in the very first sentence and then she moves on. It is never clear to me what the fuck she's talking about.
She goes on to say, I speak in this little essay of what it is that poets are doing. So poetry as praxis and what their activity amounts to in the scales of human behavior. So I would interpret that to mean something along the lines of the moral stakes that are involved.
Right. Yeah.
And she says, rather than a poetry, the verbal matter. So rather than, I think, like a text of poems or a text of poetry. So this is the way in which she's not being a literary critic. She's not examining poems. She's thinking about the practice of poetry.
So,
as an activity.
Maybe okay. So just maybe this is because of the way I think about writing poetry, but I'm curious how the two of you think about this. Is there a definable thing that you are doing when you are writing a poem that is writing poetry as an activity, independent of what you produce by that?
Are Plato's ideas just separate from his forms?
Well, ideas and
no. I'm saying like you in your life, there are times when you're writing a poem, say, whether that's in your head or on the page or whatever. There are times when you're working on a poem. Do you consider that activity to have some sort of essential definition independent of what it produces?
Yes.
Because I definitely don't. Like I work on poems and I write them sometimes, and things like I have better and worse moments, and moments when I feel kind of inspired, moments when I don't, and moments when I very rarely feel like I'm channeling something, but I don't think of that as being any kind of activity I could define. The only definable thing is what it produces, which is poetry that is either good or bad or somewhere in between.
3 stages. I think I can feel inspired and channel something and produce a poem. I think that is both engaging in the activity of making poetry and producing poetry. I can feel inspired and channel something, but fail to produce something that I see as like, I don't know, a good first draft of a poem. I think that's engaging in the activity of producing poetry, even if it isn't creating poetry. I can feel completely uninspired and just attempt to use words to make something and completely fail. I do not think this is engaged in the activity or the conceptual praxis of making of poetry.
I think there are at least two joys in being a poet, for separating that from the social world of poetry. There is a joy in composition, in the process of composition, and then there is also a joy in looking back on what you've written and appreciating what you said.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
and so I think
that's reading.
Right. I mean, yeah. Well, reading and writing. Yes, reading and
like
writing are different.
Right, but you wouldn't.
She
talks about the activity of poetry. She's not talking about reading poetry.
Right. Exactly. She's not talking about literary criticism. She's not talking about reading and then analyzing something. She's talking about the choice to engage in the activity of poetry and whether one should or should not.
Yeah, I don't think I experience or identify an activity that I would call the making of poetry. I think like there's sometimes poems have been written by me, and sometimes other things. Like at best, I would say writing is an activity, but I certainly don't think of poetry as being a definable activity. Maybe that's the problem. Maybe like she really believes in that, and that's what she's talking about here.
Well, this might be a good time to go over my little gloss. Just
go over your gloss.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. I agree that I found the argument intelligible. I found the essay intelligible, but I did think that it was elliptical at times. And my main critique of it was that it's diffuse. I think that she could have said what she said in many fewer words, which is partly what motivated me to write this in argumentative form. So this is what I think her bare bones argument is. Proposition 1. One ought to write only in the manner that best articulates truth. That's her main concern. Prop 2. Poetry by nature privileges style over substance. Prop 3. If a practice privileges style over substance, it will inevitably distort truth for the sake of style. Prop 4. What distorts truth cannot best articulate truth. Therefore, poetry distorts truth, Therefore, poetry cannot best articulate truth, and therefore one ought not to write poetry. And then she supports that with this other argument that poetry does not only distort the truth, but through its eloquence, poetry gives the appearance of truth, and it is therefore doubly deceptive, perniciously substituting titillation for veracity. And so this strikes me as being quite Platonic. And
totally, but it's like a dumb guy's Plato. It's like if Aristophanes wrote satire, like parodies not of Socrates but of Plato in his plays, it would be that argument. Like, I think you did a good job of summarizing her argument, but it truly feels like freshman dorm room Plato.
Yeah, I was gonna ask you too what you thought, if you thought there were any differences between what Plato is saying and what writing is saying.
I think Plato's telling of it is a lot more interesting, and the Republic is by no means the most interesting of his dialogues. I mean, it's the richest and big, but like, it's like he was a better writer. I don't know.
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, it's hard to beat Plato. I think, like, I probably mentioned this.
It's not hard to beat him for style, but he beats her for style, is what I'm saying.
Yeah. I think I probably mentioned on the show at some point that one of the places where Harold Bloom totally lost me was when he said that Shakespeare was more influential than like any other person. I don't know if he was accepted Jesus or not, but my immediate thought was like, Plato, are you kidding me?
Right. Like, I mean, I don't know, Genghis Khan comes to mind.
I mean, I think Bloom's point is that Shakespeare invented a way of understanding consciousness, while Plato invented a way of understanding reality and some thoughts. But I think Bloom would see that as less important than understanding human consciousness, which, in his opinion, Shakespeare pioneered in a particularly original way, which I don't particularly agree with. But I think like he'd responded that
but he trips himself up by doing what he always does, which is getting obsessed with ranking.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, but I think it's really tough to beat Plato for influence. He has shaped our minds in just inextricably deep ways, at least in the West.
Well, yeah, but he had the good luck of coming very early and like having all the culture before him being wiped out and all the culture after him surviving. You know, I think like Plato is a great genius, but I don't particularly think that he was somehow better than most of the other philosophers around. He was just more lucky in terms of timing.
He wasn't just more lucky. He had some virtues. He was pretty impressive, but
I just said he was a great genius.
Luck also helped him. Yeah.
I mean, but that you're getting, down to the mystery of like that particular period in Athens, right?
Yeah.
Where there's just such an overplus of genius that it's almost like it's like a religious mystery. It really is.
Well, this is my also opinion. Like going back to the whole chess thing, I do think that it's a sign of cultural decline that nowadays, like hundreds of thousands of people pack stadiums to see sports events. Not hundreds, tens of thousands, whatever. And back in ancient Athens, you'd have the whole city packing stadiums to see, plays. And I do think that is a demonstrable sign of cultural decline.
Yeah. It's not as simple a set of options as that. There's a lot of other stuff going into it, but yeah, I think, yeah. I mean, I don't want to disparage sports, though. I've never been a sports guy, but
I will happily disparage sports.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. Do I think there's probably more enduring value to the Oresteia than there is to the Super Bowl? Even like the best Super Bowl ever? Yeah, I do. But I just think there's so much other stuff going on in that pair of events, and comparing that pair of events. But for writing, I just thought like this argument about poetry, style matters more than substance, and so you can't pursue the truth. Like at every single turn, I wanted to say like, okay, but it's not that there's no truth to this proposition. It's just that you're like brutally simplifying things and not really defining what you're talking about. Like it is like proverbially true that in poetry, style, how you say it matters more than what you're saying. But like that's hardly the basis for a logical proposition. That's like, in order actually to get down to what that means, I think you have to take into account truth in at least in some sense beyond like the content that is delivered in this colored glass vessel. It just feels like she's simplifying things so preposterously that it becomes kind of ridiculous to build syllogisms on these claims.
Well, yeah,
Cameron,
that's one of the problems.
Cameron, how would, since you're more sympathetic to writing, how would you compare her argument to Plato's argument?
I mean, like Plato's a much more social utilitarian, right? Like he
Yes.
comes down to the idea that like poetry is gonna convince the masses of illusions, or is gonna present reality in a way that's untrue, and therefore it shouldn't be introduced. In a way that like writing's much more interested in the poetry, not even as illusion, not as like mass illusion, but as like getting away from this kind of idea of truth. And this is my biggest criticism of writing. She never defines what like what kind of truth she's talking about, because the history of philosophy in the 20th century is a series of attacks and redefinitions of truth. Like, does she mean does she believe that sort of moral truths or ontological truths can be communicated in language? Is this the kind of truth she's trying to get at? Is it more kind of aesthetic truth? Like what kind of truth and what kind of position between that truth and language is that she wants to present? Because I think without this definition, it's a lot more hazy, and it feels a lot more philosophically thin-skinned and kind of amateurish for not clearly understanding that like truth is a very huge word just to sort of sling around in the way she does, and it seems, I don't know, it seems quite hazy just in the way she's used it.
There's a moment, Elijah, and I can't find it, but there's a moment where she refers to the yearning for truth as being a religious longing. And I can't think she says that, but to me that felt like it was very revealing. It felt like this seemed like, okay, yeah, you're after something that I don't know if you want to call it Gnostic, but like you're after some essential, like cognitive holy grail where you're going to find the revealed, you're going to be enlightened, or you're going to achieve some abstract perfection, and that these filthy words are getting in the way. And it just feels like, okay, fine. I don't believe in God, and I believe there's plenty of stuff beyond us, but I don't think like there's a big system up there waiting for us to discover the key to it.
Yeah, I mean, this is typical of modernism, substituting artistic religions for religions as such. And it's another, I think, point in favor of the idea that modernism is an extension of romanticism. It's a striving, making, sort of building this palace in the sky and trying to convince yourself, like Wallace Stevens, as you talked about recently. He's creating this whole system for himself to replace religion, and then trying to inhabit it authentically. But that's really difficult to do, especially if you know that it's fabricated and subject to the limitations of yourself. I mean, that's the wretchedness of it, is that you can never fully assent to something that you've made, because you know your own limitations, and you, of course, are by nature limited, and you can only truly surrender to something infinitely beyond yourself.
But I mean, there is an easy work around this, and it's just Nietzsche. Like Nietzsche realizes that to live aesthetically does not mean to substitute religious objective truth for some truth in art. It means something more like to live with aesthetic pleasure and understand that the truth you'll get through that is an interpretation and can never be, a full thing. And it does strike me as one of the failings of sort of late romanticism, or modernism as it's occasionally, as it's mostly termed, that it doesn't, come to this more Nietzschean theory, and often sort of drags itself into these sort of grandiose, religious ideas that writing embodies.
Well, and in that spirit, I feel like Nietzsche is much closer to the postmodernists, and postmodernists, of course, love Nietzsche.
Well, yeah, but I mean, Nietzsche is a greatly more interesting human being than the postmodernists, and says a lot more things that relevant to sort of human life. But yeah, I see your point.
Much more entertaining writer.
I'm not denigrating him to their tribe. I'm just saying.
I agree.
I have a question for you, because I mentioned it, but I am genuinely interested in it, because it felt like the beginning of a sort of a description that I would love to have had it elaborated. But she says, in the ordinary way of speaking and the ordinary way of writing, called prose, which is modeled on it. So prose is modeled on ordinary speaking, ordinary way of speaking. In this way of speaking and writing, there are obvious murkinesses. The good speaker or prose writer is one who is able to keep their number low. You're good at prose if you keep the number of murkinesses low. In the poetic way of writing, which is at once a non-ordinary way of speaking, there is no escape from murkinesses, but they are concealable there. The good poet is one who keeps them so inconspicuous that they make no overt problem for his or her or anybody else's intelligence. Okay, I'm very interested in these claims. What is she talking about?
I think it might be a good, I was thinking about this. I think like a good thing we could do here is use the example of the poem On Portents by Robert Graves, which we were arguing about earlier, because I think this might help to understand a little bit about sort of poetic murkiness versus prose murkiness.
Okay, because I did think that the last sentence of that paragraph to me felt like pretty damning, and then it made me wonder what you thought of it, Cameron. Which is the impossibility of pausing in poetry as long as may be needed to make sense clear. I don't know what she means by the impossibility of pausing, so already unclear. Sorry, but that in poetry causes many a set of words actually deficient in linguistic workmanship to pass for an eloquent brevity. That felt to me, like
that's a pretty good accusation,
like devastating as an accusation. And then it made me wonder, but it also feels to me like that's how I feel often reading lines that you say are great.
Because this is why I think it might be that poem is useful.
Yeah,
because I think
so we can look at let's look at that poem.
Well, you pull it up. Should we talk about prose murkiness? Elijah, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I'd love to hear what either of y'all think that means.
Yeah, so I think that when you're writing prose, in writing's view of writing prose, you're trying to eliminate as many ambiguities and vaguenesses as possible, because ultimately what you're trying to do is convey information. With poetry, which is, as is so often described, an art form where language calls attention to itself, there's of course stylistic concern in prose as well. I think writing would say that if there's so much stylistic concern in prose that you allow all these vaguenesses and ambiguities to accumulate, then you're not writing good prose. But in prose, you could theoretically view prose as the way to try to communicate as precisely as possible. Whereas in poetry, there is this expectation of musicality or some other linguistic interest. And that, being an essential part of poetry, is, for her, going to distract from the ultimate point of language, which is to convey truth.
Right. Yeah, and I agree. I think like this edge is very close to how I often think about the difference between poetry and prose, which I think is completely unattached to medium and is more about a difference between communication and embodiment. And that's like good poetry, and I do not distinguish between verse and prose here, but good poetry for me is a way of embodying something in language with all of language's capacities, while sort of good serviceable prose is a way of communicating data. Well,
data seems a little reductive, but
well, I mean data in a very vague sense.
Well, like
information
is knowledge data? Is experience data?
Sure. Okay. Let's substitute data with information. If we understand information as a kind of catch-all term for many things.
Right. So in writing's conception, you could take a very stylistic author like McCarthy or Virginia Woolf or Joyce or somebody like that, and I think writing would say what they're basically trying to do is be poets.
Yeah.
They're just doing it in prose rather than in verse.
Whereas I agree.
The ideal prose writer would be someone who writes so lucidly that they completely disappear, and then the information just comes at you directly, and it's a pleasant experience, but it's not a vividly aesthetic experience. It's, if you gain joy and enrichment from it, it's because of what is being said.
It's a description people use very often of clear language for good and for ill. Like I've heard it used, that description of the writing just disappears. You forget you're reading. I don't know if that's an experience I have exactly. Like there certainly is reading that I find much clearer than other, and like even that is as a metaphor suggests, transparency. But yeah, I don't know if that quite
Here's a
I
metaphor
think I'm
that
always experiencing it as verbal.
here's a metaphor that works for me. I find like it feels more like skating. Like I'm moving over a very clean surface in a completely unimpeded way, and I'm moving very fast in one direction.
Yeah, I feel like I'm dancing with someone who's good at leading. Like I'm never not
Yeah,
dancing.
sure.
It's not that I stop dancing and I do something else, but that like I'm being led with a very sure hand in an enjoyable and
Mm.
coherent activity that gets somewhere, right? It doesn't feel
Yeah.
like I stop dancing and I start learning kung fu through the matrix. Like I am still doing the thing that is reading, and I am even enjoying the reading, but like the clarity and the confidence and the elegance of it is in service of. I mean, maybe it's like for me, it's the emphasis is more on denotation than on the oral pleasure for pure oral pleasure's sake, or polyvalency or whatever else. But to me, it's never not reading.
Yeah, but I think you can get lost in a book in a way where you're it's almost like a mental movie, right? Like you can read a page turner novel, or you can read a work of nonfiction and just be totally absorbed in the information, rather than, like when I read a writer who I know is very like it's their language is the thing to pay attention to. You're going to read, or I'm going to read a lot more slowly because I'm trying to savor what it is they're doing with language. And that is a different kind of reading than reading where
Right.
you're just trying to soak stuff up. And like, you know, you could consider Wolf and Joyce great writers, but you wouldn't want either of them to try to explain quantum mechanics to you. You would want someone who's able to speak very clearly and who can just articulate the information well. And in that domain, they would be a very good writer if they were able to do that.
Yeah, I
No,
mean, I guess like it's the suggestion I'm hearing from both of you seems to be when you are writing mostly in the service of clear denotative communication, you're giving up on this other thing and you're deciding to kind of write at a lower level. There is certainly what I think of as like magazine writing, which is the surface of it is covered with the dead skin of cliche, right? There's a clear like decision. There's a sort of an agreed upon decision not to care about even like the clarity, precision, not just the prettiness, but like the correctness or the freshness of the language. There's a decision to sort of work with like you're eating sort of junk food in a way that it conveys calories very quickly and it's pleasing and you can whiz through it. But to me, that's not like the clearest writing. That there is another thing that is writing that is both clear and fleet and fresh. And I think like that, to me, that's not a lower tier of writing.
No, I think that's the ideal philosopher's writing is writing that can convey ideas very clearly,
But
and
not just
elegantly.
ideas. I mean, I guess like to me, that's the ideal. That's definitely my ideal for fiction.
Yeah, see, I think Cameron would very much disagree with that.
Well, no, but Cameron doesn't want.
Yeah.
Cameron wants texture, right? And like that, but like that's like you don't want.
Well, I want embodiment.
You want embodiment, but you also like you don't want to hear
I want
spoken.
incarnation.
You don't want to hear spokenness. You want to hear verbal cobbling and composition, right? You don't.
Maybe. I'm not trying to find spokenness.
Here's what does happen to me sometimes with writing that I do think of as being very good and very clear. It's not that I forget that I'm hearing words. It's that I find myself believing in the character of the speaker. And that's something that I definitely don't experience with a lot of what is termed sort of difficult or, or even like celebrated contemporary poetry or modern poetry.
It's like it's like an utter lack of mannerism.
Well, I don't know that. I'm not sure if that's quite right. Like there are speakers who have mannerisms and there are non-speakers who have mannerisms. I guess what I mean is like it feels credible to me that some entity is speaking this. And like when I read writings poems, when I read your poem, your blind poet, Education of the Blind Poet poem, Cameron, I think is an excellent poem. I think it's really very good. there is not, I never believe in the character of a speaker there. It always feels like a poem being stitched together. Word
Well,
by word.
that's what I mean by mannerist is in like that there's I mean it in the kind of art history sense of there are deliberate techniques being used to draw your attention away uh from pure mimesis or pure clarity.
Oh, so yeah, I think my dad uses mannerist in a way that probably is not. He uses it as like a stage on a spectrum. Like after the development of a style, then there's mannerism, which is the sort of the adoption of that style.
Right. Yeah, that's how I understood
Well,
it.
it's yeah, it's the distortion of a
Right.
style
Yeah, yeah,
to
yeah.
to basically to advertise one's virtuosity in a certain technique.
But like there's poetry I read in Poetry Magazine that feels like mannered or feels like mannerism because it feels like, oh, I've heard this shtick before. I don't feel that when I read your poems, Cameron, but I also definitely don't hear a spokenness to them.
So I think I think spokenness is probably better than some of the terms we've used. Maybe, I mean, it seems like what you want is a kind of dramatic authenticity to a certain sort of human speaking voice.
Sure, sort of, except that I use drama in a technical way, and so that's not the right word either. But sort of.
Okay, let's do
Kind of.
performative authenticity to a speaking voice then.
Right, which is to me, that's like you were right earlier when I said that your taste was for verbal decadence, and you said no, it's for verbal inventiveness. And I would say like inventiveness, but like with a caloric density to it, because it's not just inventiveness at the level of the paragraph or the sentence, the inventiveness at the level of like individual word compounds. But I would say that like performative theatricality or whatever you said, like that's a little bit unfair as a representation of what I'm saying. Like to me, that's a preemptively dismissive way to characterize what I'm saying. But
okay, well, I'm not using performative in a dismissive way though. I'm just trying to use something that isn't dramatic because
sure,
you disagree with the technical
decadent.
definition of drama.
That's fine, right? Yeah, I understand. Again, like these words have different meanings in different contexts. Why don't we look at the Robert Graves poem, because I think we do have a genuine disagreement about this poem, and which I think is good. Like I think this poem is way better than almost all of the writing poems we read.
This poem was raised by Jeffrey Ho in a lecture on when he sort of talked about what he thought was missing from contemporary poetry, and he said, people should try and make poems more like this, and they would last much longer than the poems being written now.
Did he specify what probably will?
What I think he meant with the kind of attention to language at the phrasal level that goes into this poem is very different to the kind of confessional, prosaic blabbing that he found so detestable in a lot of contemporary poetry, and a kind of complete contempt for language.
All right.
He thought that this poem built language. He used this poem as an example of something that built meaning and form so closely together it could not be disconnected and could not be paraphrased. And in this way, he thought it was like it created something that was more indelible than something that could just be taken apart and sort of paraphrased and reduced purely to its meaning without consideration of its sound.
That all makes sense, and it seems consistent with Hill and with Frost and with plenty of like smart thinking on poetry. I guess I was just curious, like that doesn't seem to me like something that this poem is sort of necessarily the exemplar. Like I was curious, like if there's sort of a more specific virtue that this poem has, but yeah, like everything you're saying makes sense. I just think like that's true of a lot of poetry. This was just sort of one example of that. This wasn't something special at this point.
Yeah, well, he compared it to a tank, but I won't go into that as well. Oh yeah, so he was talking about a type of Israeli tank that when hit by a tank, yeah, TANK. And when he was talking about a type of Israeli tank that when hit by a missile, the missile, attempts to ignite the fuel, which causes the combustion of the tank. But when hit by a missile, the fuel reacts in such a way that the missile is sort of bounced back, and the fuel sort of becomes a conductive or not a repulsive element instead of an explosive element. And he was saying that he wanted a poem that knocks away the missile of someone's sort of laser-like intention to paraphrase and to extract meaning. He wanted something that cannot be sort of taken apart or blown up to find sort of his innards. And he thought this poem was a good example of something that you couldn't paraphrase and therefore was more indelible.
Oh God! But isn't that the easiest fucking thing in the world? Like, isn't that like any jumble of words will do that?
Well, only if you take no. I think like that's a
Will repel
like
paraphrase?
well, yes, but obviously
If
you
that's
need
the
like something
goal,
both
that's the
art. You
issue.
want something both artful, meaningful, and relevant to human existence. Like I think this almost goes without saying. Like I feel like you're kind of steel manning Hill that like you're kind of taking Hill and like trying to read him at like the worst possible way one
No, no,
could.
no. That's fine. Like, yeah, like he wants that on top of other things. I just feel like repelling the attempt to paraphrase feels like not like I'm all like I love the heresy of paraphrase, which is a smart essay, but like it yeah, okay, it just feels like a strange way of promoting that virtue. But yeah, why don't we read the poem? I have
Yeah,
it.
go ahead, read it.
All right, this is On Portents by Robert Graves. If strange things happen where she is, so that men say that graves open and the dead walk, or that futurity becomes a womb and the unborn are shed, such portents are not to be wondered at, being tourbillons in time made by the strong pulling of her bladed mind through that ever reluctant element. It's very short. I'll read it one more time. And tourbillons, I had to look up. It can refer to a kind of firecracker, but it's a whirlwind of flame, like a fiery spinning in the air. On portents. If strange things happen where she is, so that men say that graves open and the dead walk, or that futurity becomes a womb and the unborn are shed, such portents are not to be wondered at, being tourbillons in time made by the strong pulling of her bladed mind through that ever reluctant element. You want to say a word about it, Cameron?
It's a wonderful poem. The strong pulling of her bladed mind is just
It's great.
drilled into my psyche.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I love it.
Shall we address the paraphrase problem?
Yes.
I think it's great. I really love it, and I think I think the end is the showpiece, the strong pulling of her bladed mind through that ever reluctant element. That ever reluctant element being time. That's extraordinary. That's wonderful. I also think it begins quite well. Like it's a great beginning to a poem. If strange things happen where she is, that voice there reminds me a lot of the voice of Yeats in No Second Troy. What does he say? What else could she do being what she is? But he says, if strange things happen where she is, so that men say that graves open and the dead walk. And there's a nod there, of course, also to the little passage in it's in Hamlet, when he's citing the before the death of Julius Caesar, saying like these things happen in the streets of Rome. My question then is the third example of or the second example of weird things that can happen after graves open and the dead walk is, or that futurity becomes a womb and the unborn are shed. So this is a list of strange things that can happen where she is. And it's a great, it's a great like premise for a poem, basically saying like, oh, if you see graves opening and the dead walk around her, that's normal. That's her, that's because of the thing that she is. That's because of her nature. It's just that one of the examples he gives is, or that futurity becomes a womb and the unborn are shed. And I can make very little useful sense of that.
Right. Okay. I'll let Elijah speak in a second, but I just want to say, like, before I paraphrase this, this is a good. I think, like, I want to talk about this phrase because I want to put it under the pressure of a Bridings analysis, right? And Bridings analysis is something like poems, because of the murkiness of poetic obscurity, can create phrases which sound linguistically pleasing, but once attempting to sort of, once the denotation is extracted from them, reveal that they are kind of hollow or empty, right? And I want to see if this is true of this phrase, if it is like a case of poetic, sonic, sensuous pleasure overriding a kind of truth value, which is proven to be hollow by the absence of sense.
So because I'm Googling this poem while the two of you were explaining murkiness, is my understanding then that the murkiness she's talking about is an apparent meaning that is in fact just like a spandrel formed by beauteous versifying?
I think that's
That
one
seems like
verse.
that doesn't work for prose.
No, I think that's just one. If it is a kind of murkiness,
Right.
it's only
So what is
a
this murkiness
subspecies.
in prose versus poetry? The prose, like the function of prose is more denotation than the function of poetry is denotation. That I follow. But
Yeah, I mean,
what is
I
this
think
inevitable murkiness in prose?
it's either ambiguity or vagueness, one of those two. It can be both. I mean, it can be either.
Okay. And then her argument is that the problem is that in poetry, you're going to have the same problem you have in prose, which is that there will be moments where you're not able to convey your meaning clearly. But part of the nature of poetry is that you cover this over so that people don't notice it. And they get the impression that there is not, in fact, not a an ambiguity or not a blurring of meaning there.
Right. Like if you're more interested in making something sound cool than
Right.
in conveying information, then you'll let some of these things slide if you think they're in the interest of the aesthetic value of the poem.
Right.
Right. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. I think I follow that well enough. So then, what did you want to say about this line and a half that I struggled with, Cameron?
Well, I mean, so here's like my heretical paraphrase. I think it means something along the lines of, if you then see the future around her, if you see while she's walking around the future, right? If you see graves open and the dead walk, and you also sort of see the future, and you see sort of unborn possibilities of the future kind of destroyed, if you see this kind of chaos of destruction, like the annihilation of the future, right? Possibilities being shed, unborn, the unborn being shed, right? Like the unborn being rejected from the womb. Like I think this is what he's describing as another portent. That's my basic
Yeah.
paraphrase.
I mean, it calls to mind in a way, like a comparable claim, which I know Elijah you've cited before, which to me is like about 100 times more effective, which is the probably apocryphal claim that when the Furies first appeared in the Oresteia, the women in the audience miscarried because they were so terrified. But like that's a claim that's made about this production of the Oresteia, and to me, like that is one of these sort of signs of something extraordinary happening, right? Women miscarrying, but that's not what he's talking about. He's saying the significant event is this woman pulling her bladed mind through time. That's sort of a great way to say like, no, you should expect there to be miracles and horrors happening around her because of this extraordinary creature that she is. But then he's using as an example of a sign that could reveal the end times of Laura Writing's bladed mind arriving. One of the signs you might see is this garbled abstraction about the future, rather than like another tactile, like palpable, visible event, like the dead walking. It just feels like a very strange choice.
And yet, I think this is the claim I make for the poem, that in this kind of phrase, which I think is basically unparaphrasable, and in some senses, like much more working on vibes than it does on logical meaning, there is sort of a depth of emotional experience and a depth of atmosphere that I think is not, that I think um, out equals the depth of emotion and atmosphere in graves opening and the dead walking.
I mean, to me, this is like a patch of dead skin in the poem. It's not dead because of
I don't know, because it seems so linguistically alive.
Oh yeah, to me it feels like it's filler you can skate over, and the poem is not much affected by it because it's otherwise pretty strong. But this feels to me like it's almost like a line and a half that's most effective if vaguely and slightly misread. Like if you come away from the poem seeing like, oh yeah, there was a thing about the unborn dying. It was like, well, actually, there wasn't. It was the futurity being the womb. Like to me, like it's the like by miles the weakest part of the poem, but the poem still is
I
pretty.
mean, I disagree,
good
but
yeah.
yeah,
So Elijah,
Elijah,
what do you make of this?
yeah.
My hypothesis is that this is a very private meaning. And I think when he says, so that men say that graves open, this is Robert Graves, of course, he's very much talking about himself. He opens up in her presence. Graves open.
Sure.
And the dead walk. And this I would connect with the white goddess of these ancient chthonic archaic entities become real when he talks to her. He sees in her an embodiment of the white goddess. He sees in her an embodiment of the what was worshipped and adored by all of these cultures. Like he comes alive with an understanding and an empathy with prior cultures who idolized the feminine in his relationship to her. So the dead walk in that sense. And then I think the next line is quite difficult and possibly not paraphrasable, but I wonder, and this is, the biographical criticism creeping in. Famously, Laura Writing withheld sex from Robert Graves. And I wonder if that has something to do with it. Where she is a womb for the future because she has this huge utopian vision, but his sperm is basically going unused. And she is not a womb for children. She is a womb for something else. And is sacrificing her own motherhood to her ideological cause.
I like this interpretation. I will say that this goes really against what Hill wanted. I mean, Hill says in the lecture, Graves does not mean his name. When he says Graves, just as when I say Hill, I do not mean mine. So I do find this amusingly sacrilegious. But I think this is correct. And going back to the white goddess thing, this sort of association with the kind of female power with the womb is very much in alliance with his whole thinking along sort of fertility myths, right? And kind of sort of the feminine power of sort of natural production.
Oh man, it just feels to me like this is what would happen if Maud Gunn believed all of the things that Yeats said about her and wrote poetry. I fucking hate this woman. She's the worst. Here, because I've disparaged her so much, I will read a couple lines I think are very accurate that she I think are quite agree with in this essay. Freer rein is given in modern poetry to mental and verbal idiosyncrasy. There is a sharp decrease in the amount of common intellectual ground occupied by poets through the use of a common language. Poets more and more speak their own different languages, their personal versions of the language they use. This is what lies at the root of modern poetic obscurity difficulty. To me, that feels like ding, ding, ding. Yes, that is correct. That I think most of the difficult poets writing today, writing for the last 100 years, were not difficult because they were super geniuses. They were difficult because they were writing using their own sets of associations and then waiting for other people either to do the psychological, biographical, detective work or not. But either way, they were not actually doing the work of trying to reverse engineer someone else's comprehension.
Maybe, I don't know. I feel like this is a bit limiting. I don't think you can claim Gerard Manley Hopkins is difficult, but I don't think going into you don't need to know much apart from him as a Catholic, a priest, and that he was depressed. You don't really need to mine Gerard Manley Hopkins for biographical data, and suddenly the difficulty will become less unclear.
But I don't think difficulty. I don't think difficulty is the biggest problem that Hopkins has. I think there are other poets who are more difficult than he is. I think he writes. There are other objections I have to him that are not that. Right. But I think the difficulty, this is a sort of a disenchantment of difficulty as virtue, is my thought. And it seems consistent with your reading of that poem by Graves, Elijah.
Yeah, and I think it's consistent with the pretty true judgment of modernists as creators of their own systems of meaning, as a substitute for the trauma of religious loss.
Yeah, no, I agree.
I approve of this claim by Laura Writing. Good job. If this had been a 2-sentence essay, I would have loved it.
I think the final few paragraphs are pretty funny. I think it's quite fascinating if she starts comparing what Wordsworth and Eliot, which I think she's generally pretty correct on. And I think
she ends with a half-page parenthetical. That's the end.
I think the final paragraph is hilarious. It's so funny, and I think a hilarious description of Coleridge, and it's pretty clear that she really empathizes with Coleridge because Coleridge and her share very similar sort of philosophical desires for poetry, or she claims she used to, right? I think she's talking about poor Coleridge, and yeah, this is kind of funny. It's pretty true and quite amusing.
I think she paints Coleridge in her own image. I think she says something to the effect of, "Oh, Coleridge didn't write very much because he was so philosophically serious about poetry. But I think Coleridge just, he was a huge procrastinator, and he was also addicted to opium.
Yeah.
He was debilitated by certain personality traits and by a real drug addiction, and that's why he didn't write very much. And also he was busy writing the Biographia Literaria, which is a huge work.
Yeah.
Should we read?
The Man from Porlock is the ultimate, like, the dog ate my homework. Like,
Right.
oh no, I'm so sorry. Now you have to write poems the normal way, you fucking lazy piece of shit.
Poor Coleridge. So she's talking about Wordsworth's sort of practical advice to poets and how this sort of flies in the face of Coleridge's metaphysics. And she says, poor Coleridge devotes many, many pages of the later part of the Biographia Literaria to his agonizing perplexity over Wordsworth's critical pronouncements on the practicalities of poem making. How does the realistic, professionally common sense view of poetry voiced in them accord with the lofty elegance in Coleridge's loyal-hearted and wistful estimation of some of Wordsworth's poem writing? Coleridge pondered this wonderingly. He would have liked to be able to sustain a line-to-line course of poeticized philosophical evaluation such as Wordsworth could, but he was not merely philosophically, but religiously a more serious man than Wordsworth. I mean, that's, again, I think this is also telling, right? Like, she is also looking for a kind of religiosity, right? She talks about language priests, somehow else, like word priests are the poets, and sort of how this is a kind of false religion in a very sort of puritanical way. But it's quite interesting. I think it's quite amusing.
And you could make a parallel. I mean, a parallel in her mind, possibly, between herself and Coleridge and Wordsworth and Graves, because Graves was super prolific, and writing was not. And he wrote with just enormous facility, and he was always publishing books. He was always selling bestsellers and getting rave reviews.
Well, I would just say, like, I think there's a true, but the kind of difference there is that, like, it's like how she positioned Coleridge as this kind of poor, like, underdog to Wordsworth, and I'm not sure her like maniacal power, what desire would make her want to position herself as like this underdog to Graves, right? Like,
seems like she and Graves
agreed
that she was superior to him.
Yeah,
right. But I'm sure. I mean, as monomaniacal, egomaniacal as she was, she must have felt some insecurity about the fact that he published so much more than she did.
And to be fair, that she was like a woman in this particularly, vaguely misogynistic world, which I'm sure the modernists basically were in the early part of the 20th century. Like,
yeah, it seems like she definitely was, mistreated and talked down to and sidelined, sent by the fugitives, by plenty of people. She also was a horrible monster. It sounds like the worst. Like, she suffered some discrimination, and she was the fucking worst.
Sure. I mean, but like, out of the two of them, I'd rather meet her than Graves. Like, I think like she would have been much more interesting to talk to than Graves would be. I imagine.
Like, at least his poems can be fun to read. Again, like, I just. Ugh. That was the first part of my conversation with Elijah and Cameron about Laura writing. You can listen to the second part, which is sort of a part of it is a continuation, and part of it is a complete non sequitur. But I think they're both fairly engrossing. You can reach me, as always, at SLEERICKETS@gmail.com. And with any luck, I will be speaking to you again very soon. Until then.